Hello and welcome to Fabula Celtica, a Celtic Studies podcast.
With Tyler Baxter
And Kevin Collins.
Series 1, Ancient Ireland. Episode 3, Bronze and Iron. We are continuing our series about ancient Ireland, where we're talking about both the mythology and the history of Ireland from its earliest inhabitants, kind of into the early medieval period. If you haven't listened to our previous episodes, I do suggest you go back. These episodes sort of stack and do depend on one another. So we would love to have you take a look at those.
Today we're going to be talking to you about the Bronze and Iron Age.
Indeed we are, Kevin. And as before, I'm going to start us off with a little story. And we're going to be returning to the Lebor Gabála, the Book of the Takings of Ireland today, and looking at the third taking to start with. So here's a little extract from that taking. And again, this is from Macalister's translation in his Lebor Gabála, Volume 3. Now Ireland was waste thereafter, for a space of 30 years after Partholone, till Nevydd of the Greeks of Scythia came thither, with his 4 chieftains. 44 ships had he on the Caspian Sea for a year and a half, but his ship alone reached Ireland. These are the 4 chieftains, Starn, Yarvanel the Soothsayer, Annan, and Fergus Redside. They were the 4 sons of Nevydd. It is Nevydd who won the battle of Eosfraken against Gon and Sengen, 2 kings of the Fovera, and the twain were slain there. 2 royal forts were dug by Nevydd in Ireland, Rathkimbith in Semna, Rathkindich in Enilin. The 4 sons of Matin Munramur dug Rathkindich in one day. They were slain before the morrow in Daraliga by Nevydd, lest they should improve upon the digging. End quote. As we had with the takings of Kesser.
I was going to say, we almost had a bit of a rhyming scheme there.
We did almost, yeah. And I probably in the Irish there was actually some rhythmic aspect to it. I could look that up, but I'm not going to right now.
Why put yourself out?
Well, I will give you some samplings of the old Irish verse a little later, not this episode, but an episode or 2 out.
The ships that didn't make it, I assume they all met a great demise.
Yes. I think the implication is that they were all sunk at sea. And actually, in the earlier takings, though we didn't bring it up, if I remember correctly, there were also different ships that accompanied these leaders that did not make it there. So again, we have a repeating motif of sort of a subset with make it to Ireland.
Of death.
Yeah.
Your expertise also into Welsh mythology. Mm-hmm. Does the streak of death, I mean, is that in that as well?
We find death just about everywhere, Kevin, though in differing quantities. We'll have to talk about the Welsh mythology in the future. We will bring it in a little bit when we talk about the gods of Ireland kind of generally and make some comparisons to other Celtic figures in other parts of Europe. But that's going to be a little ways out. For now, we'll focus on the survivors of this expedition, who, as before, we have sort of the whole name of the expedition is after its leader, in this case, Nevydd. And his 4 sons are also taking precedence here. They're sort of his sub-leaders.
And how's Nevydd spelled?
It's Nemed. So those who haven't taken up Old Irish would probably pronounce it Nemid. But the M and D are in fact going to be lenited to Nevydd. In any case, we're going to see this word again later. Actually, it becomes a generic term for the noble class during the Middle Ages, which includes your kings, your clergymen, your lords, and your poets, interestingly enough. So we'll see this as a general term later, but for now it's a character. As we saw when in the second taking by Partholón, shortly after arriving in Ireland, Nevid's people encounter the Fóvera, this strange...
The one-legged, one-armed...
Yeah, they're described that way in the Partholón story, but they're not given any sort of definite description in the Nevid tale. So it's hard to say, again, whether they're monstrous creatures or whether they're just other people. Or something along the lines of a fairy sort of creature, perhaps a humanoid, but not truly human, something more magical. In any case, as a reminder to listeners, if you have not listened to our previous episodes recently, the Fóvera are pretty much always described as coming from the sea in some fashion, perhaps from under the sea, perhaps from across the sea. They're sort of raiders that come to Ireland. But Nevid's people managed to beat the Fóvera. They managed to slay these two Fóvera leaders. And then they put to work some of the captured Fóvera and have them dig what they're calling royal forts. So essentially they're going to be similar to, say, a hill fort, perhaps, an earthen-based structure with a large sort of ditch around it and a nice built-up mound for defensive purposes. So we get Nevid's arrival. They manage to deal with this Fóvera incursion. And really interestingly, just to return to that quote from the very end, they were slain before the morrow, lest they should improve upon the digging. So there seems to be some sort of concern that the people who have been enlisted, the captured Fóvera who have been enlisted to dig these forts, they can't quite get to perfection for some reason. I don't really have a good explanation for this, except for perhaps it having to do something with the payment they would be owed.
How would they have been paid in this era?
Well, theoretically, they shouldn't have to be paid at all if they're captured, which would basically mean they have no status. We have to remember that this story is being written by people during the medieval period, when there was a very definitive set of laws, oftentimes called Brehon law. I'll usually just call it early Irish law. But if you're someone who's been captured in war, you don't have status unless you're given status by a lord or a king, and in that case, you're still very much dependent on them. Your status depends on your patron, essentially.
Are they different from slaves?
I mean, they basically would be slaves, is what it comes down to, unless their patron specifically appoints them to a particular position, such as a bodyguard or something like that. So it's a little strange that they feel a need to stop them from sort of totally completing their project. But I can make a parallel to Norse mythology. There is a tale about the building of Asgard, which is the home of the Aesir, sort of the main pantheon of gods, Odin, Thor, all those people. And Loki, the trickster god, is the one who sort of instigates the building of the walls of Asgard with the assistance of the main builder, who is a giant. And the giants are a separate group of people from the Aesir, and they tend to be at odds with each other. And Loki tricks the giant who is building this wall so that the giant fails to put in the very last brick. And because the giant fails to do this, he has not fulfilled his contract, and therefore the Aesir do not have to pay him. So there may be something sort of similar going on here, but it doesn't really fit in with the Irish law that the people who wrote this text would have been familiar with. So it's a little strange.
That cheeky Loki.
Yes, very cheeky indeed.
Are you saying Marvel's source material is really just all a retelling of this?
Well, certainly the Loki and Thor aspects are retellings, or I should say adaptations, perhaps, from the Norse mythology, though many liberties are taken. In any case,
There was no Iron Man in the Norse version.
No, we do get some sort of automatons in like the Arthurian literature, but that would be a different series.
Automatons being like synthetic creatures? Or...
Yes. Yeah, you get like men that are made out of metal or bronze or whatever, who like guard otherworldly castles and that sort of thing. But not so much in the Irish, at least, that I've come across yet. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something out there somewhere. During Nevid's taking of Ireland, a similar thing happens to what happened during Partholon's taking, where the Nemedians shape the land. They clear more plains. There are more lake bursts, so sort of spontaneous eruptions of lakes on the land. And then, just like Partholon, Nevid and a lot of his people, not all of them, but a lot of them, die of plague.
Yay.
More death. Gotta love it. But not all of them die.
It serves to keep the story succinct anyway, so you don't have too many tertiary characters that you need to worry about.
Right, yes.
You also wouldn't want to be like falling in love with some character for him to meet, or her to meet their brutal demise.
Indeed. Nevid himself perishes, so we lose our titular character. But the Fovera apparently are still around, and they take advantage of this sort of sudden weakening of the people of Nevid, and they rise up. And this time it is they who enslave Nevid's people. And they basically force them to pay crippling taxes. So I'm going to read another extract
not too different from today.
Yes, very, very much indeed. So again, quoting from Macalister, just a little bit of the text here. Quote, "There was a great oppression upon the children of Nevid at the hands of the Fovera at that time, after the death of Nevid. Namely, at the hands of Mora, son of Delith, and of Coniv, son of Favor, from whom is Conan's tower named, against Ireland northwest. There the great fleet of the Fovera was lifting the tribute of Ireland. Now this was the tribute, 2/3 of the progeny, the corn, and the milk of the men of Ireland, to be conveyed to them on Ervi Samhain night." End quote. The Fovera basically, in now having apparently superior force, thanks to this plague that wiped out a large number of the Nemedians, they say, okay, now we're going to force you to do what we want, and it's to give up 2/3 of your children, not to mention all these other things, corn being a general word for grains. It's not going to be corn like the corn that's native to America. So this would be, wheat and oats and so on. 2/3 of their milk, and then specifically to be given to them on Samhain, or Samhain would be the more Old Irish pronunciation, which...
Still being Halloween.
Yes, modern day Halloween. So to be precise, I'll use the Old Irish pronunciation because, again, that's what I'm more used to, but Samhain would have been celebrated actually from the sundown, I guess, the dusk of the 31st into the morning of November 1st, because in the old Celtic calendar, the day actually started at sundown, not sunrise. So we get Halloween being a very sort of night-based tradition as a result of this. Yes, so for those of you listening who didn't know, Halloween is an Irish-based holiday originally. And we'll talk more about Samhain, and the other, what are known as the cross-quarter days, sort of the Celtic feast days in the future. But the thing to note for now is that it's generally considered to be a time where sort of the supernatural and the material world are very close together and in overlap, and anything can happen. We have this very heavy tax, and then Macalister goes on to say, quote, "Wrath and vexation took hold of the men of Ireland for the heaviness of the tax, and so the men of Ireland went to fight against the Fovera. There were 3 warriors whom they brought up with them. Seveon, son of Gyrvanel, the soothsayer, son of Nevid, and Erglin, son of Beowin, son of Starn, son of Nevid, and Fergus Redside, son of Nevid. 30,000 on sea and 30,000 on land, that was the tally of the host. And they captured the tower, and Conan and his family fell at their hands. But after the capture, Moray, son of Delith, appeared with the manpower of 70 ships, so that a joint slaughter with the Fovra and the children of Nevydd fell on the shore. Everyone who was not slain was drowned, for they perceived not the sea coming over them, and none fled from the other, so strenuous was the fight and the battle. In the end, only one ship escaped, in which were 30 warriors. They went away from Ireland, fleeing from the sickness and the tax. End quote. After this tax is imposed, the Numidians rise up, and apparently there's 30,000 of them, so they've definitely done some population since their arrival. Some decades have probably passed. Indeed, some of the people who are listed as these warriors are not only grandsons, but great-grandsons of Nevydd himself, including one of his sons, who must be rather old at this point, one would think.
The tax that's being imposed here is the 2/3 of their everything.
the tax imposed by the Fovra. So they rise up against the tax, and they manage to take this tower where they've been asked to bring the tax every year. But the Fovra managed to get some ships in with more men, and they have pretty equal numbers, and they just pretty much do away with each other. And there's only this one ship of 30 men from Nevydd, the Numidian side, that manages to get away and flee from Ireland. So, like before, we do have survivors, but this time they don't stick around. And this time, the final thing that drives them away is warfare, not plague or natural disaster.
Where do they flee to?
So, when Nevydd's people fled, they split off into two groups. One group went to Greece, and the other group went to somewhere in the north. And exactly where is a little unclear. The Nevydd text makes it sound like they kind of go through Scotland and maybe up into Scandinavia. But then later in the text, when we get to the fifth taking, that sort of second split off group, the ones who don't go to Greece, come from what are just kind of generically called islands in the north. So these could be the Hebrides. This could be like Iceland, for instance, or it could be some sort of mythological islands. We are given names of the islands, but they definitely don't correspond to any place names that we know. They sound quite fantastical. So in any case, the fourth taking of Ireland is by the descendants of Nevydd who traveled to Greece. And we're told that they don't have the best time in Greece. They do kind of live to future generations, and they grow more populous, but the native Greeks eventually enslave them, or at least force them into labor they're not too pleased about. And Fir Bolg literally means something like bagmen. And the text tries to explain why they have this name. And so here's an extract that is one possible explanation for why they are called this. Quote, "As for Seveon, he went into the lands of the Greeks. His progeny increased there till they amounted to thousands. Servitude was imposed upon them by the Greeks, carrying of soil onto bare rocks, so they were all plains under clover flowers. Sad and vexed were they at the servitude, and they came in flight, 5,000 upon the sea, and made them barks and ships of their bags." End quote. So basically, the native Greeks say, hey, you several generations out foreigners, go put soil on this barren land so that things will grow on it. And they would have carried the soil in these bags. Macalister actually translates soil as clay, which didn't really make sense to me. And the word that's used in the Old Irish is ur, which just can mean clay, but it also can just mean earth. So I went with soil. Then it says that they decide they don't like this labor, so they're going to build their own boats, and they're going to return to Ireland, and they use their bags that they carried the soil in to make the boat somehow. So perhaps the idea is that they're building something like a coracle, which is a traditional Irish boat, where the hull is it uses a leather sort of skin. And so perhaps that's what they're trying to depict here. The text goes on to say, quote, or they were called Fir Bolg because they obtained a noisome territory in Greece from the king of the Greeks, full of venomous reptiles, and the protection against the reptiles which they made was to carry with them clay of Ireland in bags, so that they were the Fir Bolg from the bags of earth which they carried with them in their canoes. End quote. This is in some ways similar in that they're named for these bags of earth that they're carrying, but in other ways totally opposite, because the earth they're carrying isn't Greek soil, it's Irish soil. And I guess on account of Ireland not having poisonous reptiles, therefore logically Irish soil repels poisonous reptiles.
Checks out by medieval thought.
Right, exactly. By the way, just to spoil everyone's fun, the whole story of St. Patrick expelling snakes from Ireland, first of all, obviously doesn't work with this, because they're basically saying before Christians came, there weren't any snakes anyways. It doesn't work out in terms of actual real history of Ireland's biodiversity. They just were never here. And thirdly, that story is actually a very late addition to the St. Patrick tradition. It comes in around 1600, if I remember correctly.
Do you know were there ever snakes here? I mean, there are snakes in England, so there's precedent that they live in this climate.
No, I think there haven't been, at least not that archaeology has uncovered. Probably snake skeletons wouldn't survive terribly well for thousands of years, so perhaps in prehistory. But no, not from what we know. It seems that they never made it all the way to the island. Of course, there are people with pet snakes today, but no, nothing that's ever lived here as a wild species. So, in any case, what the text is doing is it's sort of giving an explanation about what it thinks bolg, bag, means in this context. But it's quite possible that the word had different connotations when it was originally coined, which is quite likely, as I mentioned before, a good while before the text was actually written down. And one theory that I particularly like about the actual meaning of the word bolg is that it has to do with the idea of the Fir Bolg kind of swelling with a sort of berserker frenzy when they go into battle. So this idea of swelling is something that a bag or a bladder or a blister would do, and bolg can mean any of those words. In any case, the Fir Bolg flee Greece. They come to Ireland to where Nevid, their ancestor, had originally come in the third taking, and so they have a fourth people to come to Ireland. And their main contribution to sort of the ideas of future society in Ireland is that they are supposedly the first ones to bring the idea of kingship into Ireland. But their succession of kingship strategy is a little morally problematic, especially from the perspective of the medieval Irish people. Their whole strategy for going through different kings is through kinslaying. So, your brother goes up and takes the kingship, and then you decide, you know what, I'd actually rather like the kingship, and you go kill him, and now you're king. And as we'll see later when we talk more about early Irish law, kinslaying is one of the biggest taboos in early Irish society because of how important your family was, and because of how so much of the law hinged upon your family sort of being in your corner and supporting your position when either you do a crime or you're the victim of a crime, that sort of thing.
Even today, it's taboo to kill your brother or sister.
Strangely enough, goodness knows.
Was it always to be slain? Was there ever any element of craftiness? Poison, accidents can happen.
The Lebor Gabála itself is quite a a sweeping text in terms of how it presents things. It doesn't get into too much detail most of the time. So a lot of that sort of detail we just don't have recorded in this text specifically. And it's purely a matter of guesswork or our own imaginations.
Death being the ultimate outcome. So
Indeed.
we'll assume that it was slayed. And when I imagine slaying, it's like with a sword in
That's my perspective, yeah. And the fifth taking of Ireland, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the Fir Bolg because they are fairly quickly encounter the fifth takers, who are the Tuatha De Danann, or the Tuatha De Danann in the Old Irish pronunciation, who we brought up in our last episode. So the name, again, translates as something like the tribe of the goddess Danu, or the people of the goddess Danu. And these are the other branch of the sort of descendants of the people of Neviv who fled to the north rather than to Greece. And so we're told that the Tuatha De Danann also decide to come back to Ireland after the Fir Bolg have arrived. And we're told that they trained in sorcery in the north, wherever this north is. They're described as arriving to Ireland in dark clouds. And sort of depending on the version of the tale, there's several stories that describe the arrival of the Tuatha De Danann. There's the Lebor Gabála, but as I mentioned in our first episode, the Lebor Gabála has different recensions or different versions. There's the first battle of Moytura is a separate text that describes their arrival. And some of them say these are sort of magical clouds of mist. Some of them say that they are just fog and smoke because they burn their ships once they arrive because they want no turning back. They're like, we're here to stay.
Wow. That's quite a one-way ticket.
Yes, indeed. So it could be magical clouds. It could be even that they were in flying ships. It really depends on the version and how you interpret that version. But it's a regular description of their arrival. And when they arrive, or they meet with the Fir Bolg and they ask for half the island. Like, hey, turns out we share some ancestry. You guys look like you don't need this whole island to yourselves. So why don't you just give us half and we'll live and coexist together in peace?
Imagine the Fir Bolg didn't take too kindly to this request.
Well, pretty much. Basically, the ambassador of the Fir Bolg who met with the member of the Tuatha De, who came and gave this proposal, initially thinks, yeah, that sounds fine to me, but let me check with my people. And so he goes back to the Fir Bolg leaders, and they basically say the equivalent of, give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If we give them half now, they're going to take the whole thing. So they decide, no, we're going to go to war instead. But this war has quite a bit of lead up to it, especially if we shift our textual source to the text known as the First Battle of Moytura, which gives the confrontation between the Fir Bolg and the Tuatha De Danann in a lot more detail. Fraser has translated the first battle of, he says the first battle of Moytura, which is the sort of anglicization of Moytura, in Ériu, volume 8, back in 1915. It's quite a long text. He's takes up the first 63 pages of that journal. But I'm going to read just a small bit that I think is particularly interesting and is going to tie into our discussion of the history, the Bronze Age in particular, in just a little while. This, quoting Fraser, we have the ambassador of the Tuatha De Danann, who is named as Bresh, son of Eletha, and we have the ambassador of the Fir Bolg, who is named as Shreng, and this is their conversation. So, quote, "Remove your shield from before your body and face," said Bresh, "that I may be able to give the Tuatha De an account of your appearance." "I will do so," said Shreng, "for it was for fear of that sharp spear you carry that I placed my shield between us." Then he raised his shield. "Strange and venomous," said Bresh, "are those spears. If the weapon of all of you resembles them, show me your weapons. I will, said Shrang, and he thereupon unfastened and uncovered his thick-shafted javelins. What do you think of these weapons, he said. I see, said Bresh, huge weapons, broad-pointed, stout and heavy, mighty and keen-edged. Woe to him whom they should smite. Woe to him at whom they shall be flung, against whom they shall be cast. They will be instruments of oppression. Death is in their mighty blows, destruction in one descent of them. Wounds are their hard-plying, overwhelming is the horror of them. What do you call them, said Bresh. Battle javelins are these, said Shrang. They are good weapons, said Bresh. Bruised bodies they mean, gushing gore, broken bones and shattered shields, sure scars and present plague. Death and internal blemish they deal, sharp foe alike, and deadly are your weapons, and there is fury for fratricide in the hearts of the hosts whose weapons they are. Let us make a compact and covenant. They did so. Each came nigh to the other, and Bresh asked, Where did you spend last night, Shrang? At the hallowed heart of Ireland, in the wrath of the kings of Tara, where are the kings and princes of the Fir Bolg, and Iachith, high king of Ireland. And you, whence come you? From the hill, from the crowded capacious camp yonder on the mountain slope, where are the Tuatha and Nuatha, their king, who came from the north of the world in a cloud of mist and a magic shower to Ireland and the land of the west. It was Shrang said, I have a long journey, and it is time for me to go. Go then, said Bresh, and here is one of the 2 spears I brought with me. Take it as a specimen of the weapons of the Tuatha. Shrang gave one of his javelins to Bresh as a specimen of the weapons of the Fir Bolg. Tell the Fir Bolg, said Bresh, that they must give my people either battle or half of Ireland. On my word, said Shrang, I shall prefer to give you half of Ireland than face your weapons. They parted in peace after making a compact of friendship with each other. End quote. So that's just 2 paragraphs of the 63-page document that Fraser has translated. But we have this very sort of tactful, I would say, exchange between these opposing parties, and they actually give each other their weapons so that they know what technology the other group is wielding. And then I did not quote this part, but after this, they give a fairly long amount of preparation time, and they agree to meet at a specific time in a specific place to have their battle.
And who was the victor?
Well, given that the Lebor Gabála goes through these cycles of invasions, it is the Tuatha De Danann, the 5th group, who eventually must take Ireland, since we're going from one to the next. So the Fir Bolg do end up losing this battle, and we're told that they sort of scatter to different islands, either around Ireland or into Scotland. And interestingly enough, in later tales, there are sort of minor characters who show up who are described as Fir Bolg, and oftentimes they seem subservient to Tuatha Dé characters.
Interesting, the tactful conversation.
Yes, it's something that I think ties in well with what we're going to talk about, because what they're seeing by looking at each other's weapons and exchanging weapons is they're exchanging technology and information about technology. And the key marker of the transition from the Neolithic, which we were talking about last episode, into the Bronze Age is an evolution of technology, appropriately enough. To kind of go back to the idea of different archaeological periods and kind of putting us on the timeline exactly where we are, in Ireland is sort of a transition into the Bronze Age from the Neolithic. There is sort of a smaller sub-period known as the Beaker culture that comes in around 2500 BCE and is gone by about 1800. And the Beaker culture is marked mostly by use of ceramics and the beginnings of working with gold to create very elaborate ornaments, the beginning use of copper as well. Well, the Bronze Age, which begins around the year 2000, there's sort of some overlap between Beaker and Bronze before it's fully transitioned over, and then goes until about 750 BCE. That is marked by the evolution of weaponry, the introduction of horses, which had not been into Ireland until that point, and the introduction of hill forts, which are still a distinctive archaeological feature in the landscape today. We'll also be getting into the sort of beginning of the Iron Age and some of the major features of that period. And so that starts roughly around the year 600 BCE and goes into about 400 CE. So we finally get into the Common Era. And one of the most important features of that time in terms of the physical landscape is the establishment of what are known as the royal sites, which includes places like the Hill of Tara. And another is the arrival of Celtic languages.
The Hill of Tara being where the High King sat, allegedly?
Allegedly, yes. And we'll discuss the High Kingship of Tara in the fairly near future, actually. I think 2 or 3 episodes out. But the idea of High Kingship is one that definitely is historically not very accurate. There was never a single king who managed to gain control of the whole of Ireland in the medieval period. But there is a lot of legendary precedent for it, and there is a lot of symbolism and many motifs that are repeated that really highlight Tara's importance. Moving into some of the history now, we'll start with the beaker culture. And this is most defined by, as I mentioned before, some very distinctive ceramics that are used. Very strangely, ceramics are actually sort of totally done away with in the transition to the Bronze Age. People just stopped using them, which seems a little surprising since they're relatively easy to make and quite useful things. But Ireland has some weird stuff like that.
Was there an abundance of bronze to say that all of a sudden all of the Delphi could be, bronze plates?
Well, yeah, pretty much. That's more or less what happens as far as useful vessels. They transition to bronze and other metals. It's a bit of a mystery. Similar mystery that I don't know if I'll have a chance to bring up elsewhere. So I'll just bring it up now, is that though the bow and arrow was introduced to Ireland at one point, I don't remember exactly when, it fell out of use very quickly, despite it being an extremely useful and extremely practical weapon or even just a tool for hunting. People just didn't use it for very long in Ireland. I guess it wasn't manly enough. So there's some very sort of idiosyncratic things that happened with Ireland in terms of tech.
What took its place?
It was mostly, javelins and that sort of thing. Much less range-based weaponry. In any case, we have examples from the beaker period that include some really beautiful gold ornaments. This is when we get the very distinctive and uniquely Irish ornament called a lunala, which is sort of, as its name kind of sounds, it's sort of a crescent moon-shaped neck ornament that's sort of very flat and broad in the center, and then kind of thins out as it goes to where it would go around the neck and kind of comes to points.
Large enough to fit over the head, because I assume it's not malleable to adjust.
Well, gold is actually super malleable if it's pure enough. So I think it could go either way. There are some examples of these in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin that are well worth checking out if you're ever visiting. And I'm sure you can find some of them on their website as well. Similarly, another neck ornament that comes around is the torque, which is kind of a pan-Celtic ornamentation, it seems. So this would be kind of like the modern-day choker, I guess. It's something that would be worn very close around the neck. It would have a clasp, and we get, for example, ribbon torques, which are sort of made by a thin strip of gold that then is twisted into this lovely sort of spiraling ribbon shape. I can't imagine it was terribly comfortable to wear, but it would look very nice. One of the most interesting artifacts that have been recovered from the beaker period is known as the Lurgan canoe. And this is a 50-foot long canoe that was found carved from a single oak tree, and it was retrieved from a bog. The wonderful thing about Irish bogs is they just preserve so much for us.
Wow.
This is also on display in the National Museum of Ireland. And one of my students actually brought this to my attention, that the size of the tree that was used to carve out this canoe is so large that it's not even possible for an oak tree to grow that large in the current climate. So the fact that this particular tree was big enough to do this indicates some amount of climate change after the Bronze period to the present day, where oak trees can no longer grow to that same size.
How long did you say that was? 50
feet.
Feet. Wow.
Yep. Moving into the Bronze Age proper, we see again the very strange abandonment of ceramics, but the tradition of fine gold work that the beaker culture began continues. We see closer contact with Britain and the continent, evidenced by trade artifacts that are fairly clearly from Britain coming into Ireland and vice versa. We see the introduction of horses, and in the late Bronze Age of hill forts. And we see the depositing of precious objects, such as those gold ornaments, into deep places, especially water, sometimes bogs, sometimes something that used to be water that became a bog. And this is where we get a lot of the precious artifacts that are now on display in various museums across Ireland. So, for example, there's very famously the Rotter hoard or Brogater hoard, something like that, which includes some very elaborate ornaments such as a torque with some lovely designs on it. There's a golden miniature boat with little oars and sails.
Just for above the mantelpiece.
Yeah, I suppose so. Or, maybe it has something a little bit more significant attached to it. But in any case, there are many of these ornamentations that have been retrieved. And we also find more practical things, such as axe heads. We even have examples where things like the leather sheath have been preserved because of the properties of the bogs that they're found in. We have bodies that have been preserved in bogs, known as bog bodies, that date as far back as the Bronze Age, and oftentimes seem to have been the victims of sacrifice based on sort of the injuries that we're able to find still preserved on their bodies.
Their bodies must be very well preserved, more than just the skeleton.
Oh, yes. There's still flesh, there's still fingernails. There's 4 of them, again, at the National University. I'll keep harping on about that.
What have they got them in now? Formaldehyde?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what it is now, but they have some way of keeping them preserved still. Or maybe they're just so... maybe it's almost like fossil. I'm not quite sure how the process works. I'm not a chemist or a biologist, but perhaps the bogs have gotten them to a point where it's more or less the equivalent fossilization. I don't really know, but they're quite. You can look them up online again if you are interested in, but they can be a little disturbing to look at if you're not up for that. So just again, kind of reflecting that idea, I almost think of. I think it's helpful to remember this stuff by attaching it to a narrative. And so for me, it's almost like the Fir Bolg in our story at the beginning represent, actually, and Nevydd, I suppose, represent sort of Bronze Age Ireland. Nevydd, in that story, he creates these forts by enlisting the Fovra, and in the Bronze Age, we get the introduction of hill forts. With the exchange between the Tuatha Dé and the Fir Bolg of their weapons. They're exchanging technology, and technology is evolving from the Neolithic into the Bronze, and from the Bronze into the Iron Age. The Iron Age starts around 600 BCE and then goes about to 400 of the Common Era. And after that is when we get into the medieval period and we start getting written text for the first time. So in a couple of episodes, we'll be transitioning to evidence from sources that's not just mythological and archaeological, but also that comes from written history. In any case, the Iron Age is when the first Celtic speakers seem to arrive in Ireland. But there's a lot of uncertainty around this.
Where did they arrive from?
That's part of where one of the uncertainty is from. So they could be coming from Britain. They could be coming from the continent. Certainly from somewhere to the east, because that's where the land is. Where crossing the Atlantic wasn't quite an option at this point.
When you say Celtic speakers, I mean Gaelic is derived from that Celtic language.
Yeah,
and Brehon.
Yes. So we've actually been sort of cheating up to this point. This is supposed to be a podcast about Celtic people, but the prehistoric people of Ireland, up until some point in the Iron Age, technically weren't really Celts because they did not speak a Celtic language. They did not necessarily have any cultural markings that match with Celtic peoples of the continent and of Britain. We get that first bit of evidence during the Iron Age instead. But that suggests that there may have been a population movement into Ireland, bringing these speakers. We're not entirely sure. There are place names and population names that are preserved from this time period. We do get written sources from outside of Ireland, even though we don't get written sources from inside of Ireland that preserve things like tribal names, for instance, mostly from Greek and Roman writers. And this is actually when Ireland kind of first comes onto the radar of the Greek and Romans, is during the Iron Age. And in fact, people might be aware that the Roman Empire at a certain point expanded as far as into much of Britain, but the Romans never actually invaded or conquered Ireland, so they didn't make it quite this far west.
But they called it Hibernia, which is like land of perpetual winter, right? So,
which is fair enough to say. I think summer is certainly a short affair here.
Yeah, it just didn't suit them really. The weather, they're like, nah, this is too cold.
Indeed. And we'll look at what some classical writers have to say about Ireland during the Iron Age as well. According to, we'll just go in order from, there's actually really very few and very short accounts from classical writers about Ireland. So I'll just go through a few of them, but you're not missing much for what I don't go over. Starting with a text that survives in a 4th century CE copy, but is believed to date back to the 6th century BCE originally, is ascribed to Avenius in the Ora Maritima. And this translation is from Philip Freeman in Carey's Celtic Heroic Age. Quote, "From here, it is a 2-day voyage to the sacred isle, for by this name the ancients called the island. It lies rich in turf among the waves, thickly populated by the Hiereni. Nearby lies the island of the Albiones. The Tartesians were accustomed to trade even to the edge of Ostromenides. The Carthaginian colonists and people around the Pillars of Hercules frequented these waters. 4 months scarcely is enough for the voyage, as Himilico the Carthaginian proved by sailing there and back himself." End quote. This Avenius seems to not have too much bad to say about Ireland. It seems like he thinks it's very rich in resources. It's just a little far away, a little inconvenient to get to. But we have some less happy people about the state of affairs in Ireland. So this next account is from Strabo in his Geography. Quote, The voyage from Celtica to the north is currently said to be the most extreme. By this I mean the voyage beyond Britain to Érenn, a wretched place to live because of the cold, beyond which the lands are considered uninhabitable. They say that Érenn separated from the Celtica by not more than 5,000 stadia. So stadia is a measure of distance. Continuing on, there are also other smaller islands around Britain, the largest being Érenn, which lies to its north and is longer than it is wide. Concerning this island, I have nothing certain to report, except that the people living there are more savage than the Britons, being cannibals as well as gluttons. Further, they consider it honorable to eat their dead fathers and to openly have intercourse, not only with unrelated women, but with their mothers and sisters as well. I say these things not having trustworthy witnesses, and yet the custom of cannibalism is said to be found among the Scythians, and because of necessity during sieges, the Celts, Ibernians, and others besides are said to have practiced it. End quote.
Says, reminiscent of like Caligula. And I mean, is that what Rome was exporting? Just like mad sex?
Yeah, it's certainly not the most palatable description, is it? I do appreciate that he at least says, I have no trustworthy witnesses for this, so I'm just spitting hot garbage mostly. But I mean, I do like that it ties in a little bit with what we were talking about last episode with the potential incest at Newgrange among the people who originally used those burial mounds during the Neolithic period. So perhaps there is something to it. The cannibalism seems like a bit of a stretch to me. And I really like that he groups cannibalism with gluttony, suggesting they're just eating lots of their own people. So it's quite the colorful description, if nothing else. Moving on to Isidorus, who was writing around 25 CE. In his De Chorographia, we learned that, quote, above Britain is Uverna, almost the same in area, but oblong with coasts of equal length on both sides. The climate is unfavorable for the ripening of grain, but yet it is so fertile for grass, not only abundant but sweet, that livestock eat their fill in a small part of the day. Unless they were restrained from this pasturage, they would burst from feeding too long. The inhabitants of this island are unrefined, ignorant of all the virtues more than any other people, and totally lack all sense of duty. End quote.
Wow, that's very harsh.
It is a little harsh, isn't it? Yeah. So this Isidorus sort of is kind of between our first two descriptions. The first one was really, abundant resources, and Isidorus is kind of like that, at least abundant grass, so abundant for livestock. But like Strabo before him, not too fond of the people there that he clearly hasn't even met. Because, the Irish are wonderful people.
Right. Well, we've refined ourselves a lot over the years.
Yeah. No longer cannibals, most of us anyways. We'll do just a couple more, and then we'll move back to talking about the Iron Age folks. But again, these descriptions are from the Iron Age period, so they are a very biased window, I would say, into the Iron Age inhabitants of Ireland. But they're something that we do have, so there may be value in them, and there's certainly entertainment value if nothing else. So Tacitus, writing around 98 CE, in his Agricola, writes, quote, in the 5th year of the war, Agricola, crossing in the lead ship, conquered tribes unknown until the time in frequent and successful engagements. That part of Britain which faces Hibernia, he garrisoned with troops, more out of hope than fear. For Hibernia, lying between Britain and Spain, and placed strategically in the Gallic Sea, would unite the most robust parts of the empire to the great advantage of both. In size, it surpasses the islands of our sea, but is narrower than Britain. As for soil, climate, and the character and lifestyle of its people, it differs little from Britain. The approaches and harbors are better known due to trade and merchants. Agricola has taken in one of their tribal kings, driven out by an internal discord, and was keeping him under the pretense of friendship for the right opportunity. I often heard him say that Hibernia could be conquered and occupied by one legion and a moderate number of auxiliaries. Moreover, it would be useful against Britain as well if Roman arms were everywhere raised high and liberty, so to speak, vanished from sight." End quote. So this one's interesting in that he seems to be a little bit less critical of the Irish people, but he actually seems to be thinking they're not militarily very strong and would be really easy to conquer if Rome just wanted to put in a tiny bit of effort. And yet Rome never did anything about Ireland.
I think, and then Britain did. I mean, it would be a weak point, right? I mean, if they had a base.
Yeah, there was a bit in me that wanted to bristle at him describing the Irish as being different really from the Britons. I think lots of people in Ireland today would not be too happy with that description. No offense to anyone in Britain, except for a large subsection of the population.
Nobody who's alive today, anyway. It's only your ancestors at fault.
But I'll just keep the politics out of it, I suppose. But anywho, there's a bit in here where he talks about knowledge of the harbors of Ireland being well known on account of trade. And we do know, again, that there was trade between Britain and Ireland at this point. Again, Britain would have been the closest sort of Roman outpost. So he seems to be implying perhaps that Rome was actually trading with the Irish potentially, or the British who were occupied by Rome were trading with the Irish. It's a little unclear, but that sort of corroborates what the archaeology tells us. Last little bit I'm going to read is from Silenus in about 200 CE in the Collectanea Rerum Memorabilium. And Silenus says, quote, "Britannia is surrounded by many not insignificant islands, of which Hibernia comes closest to it in size. The latter is inhuman in the savage rituals of its inhabitants, but on the other hand is so rich in fodder that the cattle, if not removed from the fields from time to time, would happily gorge themselves to a dangerous point. On that island there are no snakes, few birds, and an unfriendly and warlike people. When the blood of killers has been drained, the victors smear it over their own faces. They treat right and wrong as the same thing. There have never been bees there, and if anyone sprinkles dust or pebbles from there among the hives, the swarms will leave the honeycombs. The sea, which lies behind the island and Britannia, is stormy and tossed during the whole year, except for a few days when it is navigable. Those who have made a trustworthy measurement of the distance of this passage say it is 120,000 paces." End quote.
But do you think it was as savage as they describe? I mean, obviously, if you're coming from perhaps Rome, you're quite cultured. You know, you're essentially going to a place that is full of savages.
Yes. I mean, I think we have to take pretty much all of the classical writers writing about the Celts as writing propaganda. Even many decades and centuries later, we have to remember that it is Celtic peoples who, in the past, sacked Rome successfully. And so there's some, I think, deep generational trauma in the Roman Empire from that event, and they pretty consistently paint the Celts in a bad light from there on. Whether they're actually considering the Irish Celts at this point is a little harder to say. The Romans typically don't actually use the word Celt. They typically will say the Galli or the Gauls, but obviously the Irish are not Gauls. Gauls would be in continental Europe and modern day France primarily.
Like Charles de Gaulle's.
Yes. We'll have to talk more about that word Celt in the near future. But for now, I think the things to note here are there's some themes that seem to be carrying through all these descriptions, which are a land rich in sort of vegetation and livestock feeding, a sort of indulgence among either the cattle or the people or both, a general depiction of the people as being very savage and amoral. The part that I particularly enjoyed from this is further confirmation there are no snakes. But the idea that there are no bees is very interesting. And the idea that the soil of Ireland will drive bees away because there are no bees there exactly mimics that idea that we saw from that explanation of the Fir Bolg being the bagmen because they carried around the soil of Ireland and could use it to drive away venomous animals. So there's again just these resonances that keep popping up, and it makes it hard to not think that there's something to them.
But the soil emanates some kind of magic.
Yeah, and we get this too in later saga stories and so on. For example,
It's the first time that I've heard the soil being used in such a negative connotation, because I would have always said the land, and the Irish, and it leads into this fairy mythology and the willow trees and the oak trees, that there's something positively magical about the soil here as opposed to it being a repellent.
I mean, I don't know that it is really a bad repellent, though. Like, driving away venomous snakes should be a good thing for people, at least. Driving away bees is a useful thing for collecting honey. So I think it's actually being depicted in a positive way in that sense.
Okay.
We also have, just speaking of the idea of soil, we get in later legends. I believe it's in the tale of Oisín going to Tirnaog, when he goes to essentially an otherworld island. He spends some time with the hot women there, and then it gets a little homesick. He's like, yeah, I'd like to go home, visit Ireland. And then the otherworld women break it to him that, oh, sorry, honey, I know it feels like a year has passed here, but it's actually been 300 years over there. And if you touch the soil, all that time's going to catch up to you, and you'll age immediately and turn into dust.
This is like the Indiana Jones kind of bit where just...
Yeah, so there's a negative Irish connotation, I suppose. Anyways...
time seems to be a tangent that runs through these stories.
There is a huge idea whenever we come into contact with the other world. Not whenever, but most of the time when we come into contact with the other world, where there's some amount of distortion of time that happens. So yes, we are definitely going to return to that idea. We saw it when we looked at the story, the extract from the wooing of Aideen, with the Dagda stopping the sun in the sky for 9 months. We saw it in the Denhenicus story, where King Bressel's sister stops the sun in the sky as well. This idea of distortion of time comes up again and again and again. To return now to the Iron Age, I mentioned that one of the major features of that time period is the establishment of what are called, as kind of a blanket term, the royal sites of Ireland. And they're called this not because of the reality of their historic or prehistoric use, but because of how they are depicted in the legendary sources and in the sagas. And there's essentially one per major province of Ireland, but not the modern provinces exactly. There is a place that is associated with Ulster, for instance, and the four modern provinces, but actually in the medieval period, people typically thought not of 4 provinces, but of 5.
Was Meath? Wasn't it Meath?
Yes, indeed. Meath was the 5th province. It wasn't a single county. It was a larger area that bordered really all the 4 other counties, just barely bordering Munster. Just a little tip. That was sort of considered and Meath, Meatha in the Old Irish, comes from a word that means middle. So the middle province, the center province. And this, of course, is the location of Tara, or Tever in the Old Irish, which is the sort of penultimate site of kingship. And it's often paired with Ishnach, which we were having a conversation about earlier off of the podcast. But it's a hill that's sort of considered the geographical center of Ireland, so it has a lot of legendary connotations with it as well, and is very frequently associated with Tara. So yes, from the perspective of 5 provinces, Tara is the so-called royal site of Meath or Meatha, and then we have in Ulster, we have Navan Fort, in the Old Irish Evan Vacha. In Connacht, we have Cruachan in County Roscommon. In Leinster, we have Dún Allina. Knockallin, I think is how you pronounce the anglicized version, located in County Kildare. And in Munster, in our province here, but in County Tipperary, not in Cork, we have Cashel, often called the Rock of Cashel. And interestingly enough, that is the only one of these royal sites that still has a building on top of it, though it is not an Iron Age building by any means. It is a later kind of, I think at the middle of the medieval period, maybe 14th, 15th century church ruin that is atop the Rock of Cashel. But the idea of these royal sites harkens back to what we were talking about with the taking of Nevis, when he had his captives dig what were called in the text two royal sites or royal forts for him. And in general, the layout of these sites is that there's a sort of an enclosure formed by an earthen ditch around a hill or a mound. And atop that mound, there's usually some smaller earthen structures that remain and evidence of some kind of buildings of probably ritual significance, probably not residential, actually, probably not actually used by kings necessarily as a place of residence, though it's hard to be certain. Again, they're prominent in later legend and sort of get repurposed as these places of kingship for especially the pre-Christian kings of Ireland. And they're quite unique across Europe. There's not really anything like them in any other part of Europe or any other part of the world that I'm aware of.
Nice.
Yeah, so that being said, we're going to be talking about a couple of these sites going forward. Really, we're going to look at Evanwache in Ulster, because there's some really, really interesting archaeology involved there. And we're going to look at Tara as well, being such a site of significance for the mythology that we're discussing. But for now, the last thing that I want to set up is the reality of provinces is that it wasn't as clean as there being 5 of them during the medieval period. And probably even less clear-cut during the prehistoric period. Who knows if people even thought of provinces at all at that point. Again, that's before we have any written sources to go off of, at least from within Ireland itself. So in the medieval period, the general structure of society was they were built around small, what we might call petty kingdoms, or tuatha. So we can think of them as these groupings of about 2,000 to 3,000 people on average in these fairly small groups. But oftentimes a particularly militarily strong king of a single tuath might manage to use force of arms to take control of multiple tuatha, and in that way sort of become an over-king of a larger area. And that's how you get the idea of sort of provincial kings of larger holdings. But in, say, for example, around the year 900, so kind of getting in from the early medieval period towards the kind of mid-medieval period, we have something that's more like probably about 8 kind of larger areas of control, and a couple of them that are geographically separate are controlled by the same dynasties. So we have the Inail, for instance, clan are particularly prominent. They have sort of a chunk of what is modern day Ulster. They have a chunk of what is modern day Leinster. And then there's some sort of other people that are between them. We have the Uliv, that name for the Ulstermen are kind of more peripheral on the east coast of the island. They don't have all of the sort of that northern section that we now think of as Ulster, and so on. So these provinces are still useful to talk about geography, but we do want to keep in mind that the reality of sort of the political divisions of power were not necessarily so clear-cut.
Does it factor in that, as we were described as savages, it would be very hard for there to be a successful hierarchy because of the warring nature of the Irish, as it were?
Right. So we have to kind of extrapolate quite a bit to get back to what was going on in the Iron Age in terms of hierarchy. So it's hard to say really anything about that point in time, since we don't have written sources from within the island, and since the written sources we do have, which we saw extracts of, are so kind of sparse on the details, and so sort of biased generally against the Irish inhabitants. But we do know that after writing comes in and we start getting Irish law written down and we start getting descriptions of Irish society, it is extremely hierarchical and extremely structured, at least in terms of what things were supposed to be legal and how things were supposed to work. And there are strong indications that is a sort of culture that came from before that period of writing, that came really from Iron Age Ireland, and then was sort of put together with Christianity when Christianity arrived and introduced writing. So I think we can go back to some extent, at least in the late Iron Age. Tentatively, everything is tentative, but tentatively, we could say it's likely that there was some hierarchy. It's likely that there was much more order than seems to be indicated by these classical writers. All right, so next time we will look at some archaeological mysteries from the Iron Age. We'll look at the royal site of Evanvacha in Ulster. We will look at a very interesting little archaeological site called the Corlea Trackway. And of course, we will look at the myths and legends associated with them.
Sounds very exciting. You've laid the foundation for that, and there's a lot more to discuss.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you for listening to Fabula Celtica
with Tyler Baxter
and Kevin Collins.
Please rate and subscribe and follow us at Fabula Celtica on Twitter, Instagram, or email us at fabulaceltica@gmail.com.